20 years ago, in May of 2005, Star Trek Enterprise aired its final episode. It was a big deal, and not just because it was the end of the series. When Enterprise premiered in the fall of 2001, it did so with great fanfare, accompanied by a lot of hype and a lot of hope. The hope was that this new show, being promoted as a stripped-down, back-to-basics prequel, would lift the Star Trek franchise out of the popular and creative decline it had been on since its peak in the mid-1990s. And that hope went unfulfilled. Not only did Enterprise fail to meet expectations as a series, its series finale is today regarded by many fans as the worst Star Trek series finale yet produced. It's thought of as being so bad and is the product of creative decisions so baffling and so upsetting to so many in the audience that some fans decided to simply reject it, to treat it as though it doesn't exist. Doesn't exist from an in-universe point of view, obviously. It clearly exists as an episode of television. I watched it when it aired, and it's on DVD and Blu-ray and streaming. It's a thing that people made, and it's just as real as any other episode of Star Trek. But from that in-universe perspective, is there a case to be made? Do those fans who want to totally disregard the series finale of Enterprise have a leg to stand on? What I'm asking is, did Star Trek Enterprise's final episode even actually happen? Again, happen from an in-universe point of view. None of it happened from a real-world point of view. I'm the last person you need to point that out to, okay? I'm always pointing out that to other Trekkies, and they fucking hate me for it. They are so sick of me and my "it's a work of fiction" shit. Anyway, as long as I'm talking about it being a work of fiction, after 4 seasons that were mostly underwhelming despite some undeniable bright spots, Enterprise had become the first Star Trek TV series since the animated series in the 1970s to be canceled by the network rather than ended by the show's producers on their own terms. TNG, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager had all enjoyed 7-season runs. Enterprise was ending after a respectable but comparatively brief 4-season run, having produced less than 100 episodes. But it wasn't just the fact that Enterprise had not succeeded to the level of its 3 predecessors. Enterprise was also the first Star Trek series, since the animated series, to end without another Star Trek project already in production, or at least in active development. When TNG ended, Deep Space Nine was on the air, and Voyager was in the pipeline, as was the first of the feature films to star the TNG cast. When Voyager ended in the spring of 2001, it was already well known that Enterprise would be debuting that September. Now, in spring of 2005, Enterprise was ending, with no new Star Trek TV series or film on the horizon. So, the last episode of Enterprise also felt a little bit like the last episode of Star Trek. Even if that seems a little silly now, given how much more Star Trek has been produced since then, and how active the franchise is at the moment, the finale of Enterprise was still a milestone. The end of a nearly 20-year period during which there had continuously been at least one Star Trek TV series in production. The producers of Enterprise, including series co-creators Rick Berman and Brannon Braga, who had sat at the top of the pyramid of the Trek franchise since TNG, obviously recognized the moment they were in and attempted to craft an hour of television that would serve not only as a farewell to the adventures of Captain Jonathan Archer and his crew, but would also be a fitting capstone to all of Star Trek up to that point. What they came up with was These Are the Voyages, an episode that takes place several years after the previous episode, that shows us Captain Archer and the gang running into some trouble on their way back to Earth, where Enterprise is to be decommissioned, and Archer is to make an address at an historic assembly of planetary representatives, where the charter for an interstellar alliance is to be signed. Archer's old frenemy Shran shows up one last time. They return to Rigel 10, which was the setting for much of the show's first episode, and at the end, Archer's on Earth, stepping out into the assembly hall to deliver his big speech. It's standard issue last episode stuff. Favorite recurring characters stopping by one last time, revisiting an important location from earlier in the series, the lead protagonist getting ready to do something important or reach some life milestone. Lots of series finales hit these same basic beats, and if executed well, it's a reliable formula for giving a show a satisfying send-off. But in the case of Star Trek Enterprise, there were two big problems. Problem number one, they killed off Trip. Charles Tucker III, aka Trip, is the chief engineer of Enterprise and Captain Archer's best friend, and apparently the people who were still watching Enterprise at the end of Season 4 really liked him, because they were not happy when he heroically sacrificed himself to save Captain Archer and Enterprise from a gang of space pirates that had boarded the ship looking for Shran. And speaking as someone who was not the biggest fan of Enterprise, I kinda understand it. I wouldn't call Trip the show's breakout character exactly. Enterprise didn't really have one of those. But along with Archer and First Officer T'Pol, Trip was one of the show's three most important characters. Killing him off would be like classic Star Trek killing off, I don't know, Spock. Can you imagine? Or TNG killing off, I don't know, Data. Can you imagine? Or Deep Space Nine killing off, I don't know, Dax. I think you get it. Trip's not just one of the leading members of the show's ensemble, he's a likable character. Connor Trinneer plays him with an affable, everyman quality, his loyalty to Archer is endearing, and his romance with T'Pol is one of the few long-term character arcs that the show actually stuck with. Of course his death was going to upset people. That was the whole point of doing it. To give the final episode something with an emotional impact, to make the audience feel something. To give the final adventure of Captain Archer's Enterprise a portion of tragedy to balance the triumph. Knocking off a major character is also a tried and true final episode move, and, I mean, it was the final episode of Enterprise. It's not like anyone saw movies or a spin-off coming down the pike. We weren't expecting to see any of these characters again anyway, so why not kill off Trip? Hell, why not kill off everybody? There was literally no reason not to. The fans who were pissed about Trip should be grateful Trip was the only one. They got off easy. Killing Trip is just the first problem people had with the finale, though, and it pales in comparison to the second one. Problem number two, they set the entire episode in a holodeck. This aspect of the episode has been talked about to death. I've talked about it before, so I don't want to repeat myself too much here. I'll just tell you, basically, that the writers of the final episode of Enterprise, those writers being Rick Berman and Brannon Braga, the co-creators of the series, made what is to this day one of the most baffling creative decisions ever made by any writers of any television show ever, and opted to frame the finale of their series, the last episode they were ever going to make, as a holodeck program being watched by characters from a completely different series. It's revealed in the teaser that everything we're seeing that takes place aboard Captain Archer's Enterprise is, within the world of the episode, actually taking place on the holodeck of the Enterprise D, during the events of the 7th season Star Trek The Next Generation episode, The Pegasus. Not only does this decision result in much of the episode, which, again, is the last episode of Star Trek Enterprise ever, centering on the characters of Commander Riker and Counselor Troy as we follow them around the Enterprise D and watch as they wander around a recreation of Archer's Enterprise's bridge like a couple of nerds on a set tour. It also effectively means that the real Enterprise characters never even appear in the episode at all. We never see Captain Archer. We see a hologram of Captain Archer. That might not seem like that big of a deal. We still get to see all the regular actors, and they're playing their regular characters, even if technically we're only watching a simulation. And truthfully, in any other episode, it wouldn't necessarily be a big deal. It's a conceit that could work. Similar things had been done in Star Trek shows before this. Remember that episode of Voyager where it turns out we haven't been watching the actual Voyager crew, but duplicates who think they're the Voyager crew? And the episode ends when they all die? Whether or not you think that's a good episode of Voyager isn't my point. My point is your opinion of that episode would probably be different if it was the last episode of Voyager ever made. If it was the intended series finale that the creators of the series wrote knowing it would be the last episode. Like, you know how I was talking earlier about the formula for series finales and the beats and tropes that they usually have? One of the most important tropes for a series finale is to have the characters from the series in it. But I'm getting off topic. This isn't about why the Enterprise finale sucks. I did that video already. This is about something else. See, the combination of those two problems, the death of Trip and the decision to set the entire episode inside a holodeck during an episode of another show, made the last episode of Enterprise so underwhelming, so disappointing, so despised, so unacceptable that some fans decided that they weren't going to accept it. They told themselves and each other and anyone else unfortunate enough to find themselves dragged into the conversation that, actually, it's okay that the last episode of Enterprise was the shits, because it didn't actually happen. This is what's known as a coping mechanism. Coping mechanisms are typically used by people who are dealing with legitimate forms of stress or anxiety or trauma, but sometimes they're also used by people who just really didn't like what happened on a TV show. Star Trek fans have a history of this. Remember that episode of Voyager, Threshold? The one where Tom Paris breaks the Warp 10 barrier and turns into a giant salamander for some reason, and then he abducts Captain Janeway and turns her into a giant salamander too, and then they fly to a planet and have off-camera salamander sex and make salamander babies. Lots of fans just pretend that episode never happened. I guess the thought of those poor salamander babies being abandoned to die without their parents is too depressing. I don't know. It goes well beyond Star Trek fans. Remember when certain Star Wars fans were so mad about the sequel trilogy that they started a petition to try and force the studio to declare that the sequel trilogy was officially not canon and then remake all three movies? Wasn't that adorable in the most annoying fucking way? But unlike the soft-hearted salamander huggers in the first group and the white nationalists in the second, people who insisted that the Enterprise finale should be waved off as not having actually happened actually have a loophole to exploit in the episode itself. And in an irony so fitting it could never have been written that way on purpose, especially not by Berman and Braga, the loophole is created by those two problems that made fans hate the episode in the first place. Trip dies, the episode tells us, but the episode also tells us that we're not seeing the actual events. We're seeing a holodeck recreation of those events, which means what we see in the episode might not be what actually happened. What if the holodeck program Riker is playing is historically inaccurate? What if someone, for some reason, altered the records between when the events took place and when Riker plays the holo program? What if Trip isn't dead after all? I mean, by the time Riker's watching that holodeck program, Trip's definitely dead, but you know what I mean. Even with a loophole in the episode, or as pretentious know-it-all English majors like me say it, the text, to use as a starting point, the notion that the events of Enterprise's final episode didn't really happen is the sort of thing that usually remains nothing more than fodder for fan fiction. But in this case, those fans who insisted there was more to Trip's apparent death than was shown in the episode, I'm going to call them Trip Truthers. In this case, the Trip Truthers had something else working in their favor. There was no more Star Trek being produced for television or the movies for the foreseeable future. The only new Star Trek being produced, officially that is, after the end of Enterprise, was in print. There was no new TV, no new movies. Even the comic book license had expired a couple of years before Enterprise ended. But Pocketbooks, the publisher that has controlled the license to Star Trek prose fiction and reference books since the late 1970s, was still cranking out those tie-in novels. Even though the novels were never considered canon, they were still required to conform to the events of the shows and movies which were canon. Novel writers were allowed to tell their own original stories, create their own characters, play around in the gaps left open by the shows and the films, but they couldn't make any major, lasting changes to what was established on screen. They couldn't retcon stuff, or kill off a major character, or bring back a major character who had been killed, until, that is, the end of Enterprise, after which the restrictions were loosened. Just a little bit. With no new Star Trek TV shows or movies on the horizon, the powers that be in charge of the Star Trek license at Pocket Books allowed writers of novels set after the end of the series in question to be a bit more creative. In the case of the Enterprise novels, that meant, among other things, the revelation that our favorite Florida man, Trip Tucker, was alive and well in the years following the supposed events at the conclusion of Enterprise. In the Star Trek Enterprise novel, The Good That Men Do, written by Andy Mangels and Michael A. Martin and published less than 2 years after the original broadcast of These Are the Voyages, it turns out that Trip faked his death, and the official account, the version Riker saw in that holodeck program, is part of a cover-up by the Federation government to conceal what really happened from the public. What really happened was, Section 31, those rascals, they found out the Romulans were developing an advanced warp engine, so they recruited Trip to go undercover as a Romulan and sabotage it. Trip fakes his death, is surgically altered to appear Romulan, and as such becomes one of the first humans to actually see what Romulans look like, and infiltrates a Romulan terrorist cell that is working to overthrow the current Romulan government. And from that point on, Trip is pretty much a spy. He goes from working undercover as a Romulan to working undercover as a Vulcan. Then, like 2 or 3 novels later, he finally gets to work undercover as a human again. He's an interstellar man of mystery, baby. Yeah! For those of you who don't yet need to be reminded to schedule your colonoscopy, that was an Austin Powers reference. It was a movie in the 90s. Ask your great-grandparents. According to the novels, Trip is active doing espionage during the Earth-Romulan War. Then he continues working for Section 31 after the war, infiltrating terrorist cells, working against the Orion Syndicate. Almost everyone from his life on the Enterprise thinks he's dead. Only Captain Archer and T'Pol know he's still alive, and they don't approve of his activities with Section 31, and Trip himself eventually becomes haunted and disillusioned by the things he's done as a spy. And though he is finally able to settle down with T'Pol on Vulcan, he never returns to his old life. So there you go. Did the events of Enterprise's final episode even actually happen within the fictional world of Star Trek? No! Riker's hologram presented a falsified narrative, and the truth was that Trip faked his death and lived on and became a morally compromised and emotionally wrecked super spy. You don't have to take my word for it. Take a look. It's in a book. Except, so, you know how I said the novels were allowed to get a little more creative after the end of Enterprise when there were no Star Trek shows or movies in production for a while? Well, they did get more creative. The writers of the novel set in the post-TNG DS9 Voyager years really took advantage of their newly granted freedom and wrote stories that depicted Captain Picard and Dr. Crusher getting married and having a son named Rene, the Borg launching yet another invasion of the Federation, Picard becoming Locutus again, Voyager, under the command of Captain Chakotay, joining a fleet of ships back to the Delta Quadrant, Ben Sisko returning from the wormhole, Deep Space Nine being destroyed and replaced by a new Deep Space Nine. They kinda just went for it. What the hell, right? It's not as if they had to worry about contradicting the movies and TV shows, because there weren't any. For a while. Anyway, long story short, when Star Trek went back into production and they started making TV shows again, starting with Discovery in 2017 and following with Picard in 2020, naturally, they wanted to continue publishing tie-in novels based on the new shows so they could continue to wring every last cent out of the ever-dwindling audience. However, the novels that had been published since the end of the previous production era had diverged so much from where the various TV shows and movies left off, that their version of recent Star Trek history and the version of recent Star Trek history depicted in the first season of Star Trek Picard were irreconcilable with each other. And since the producers of the show and the publishers of the books knew only too well how many literal-minded little pedants there were in their fan base, they decided to take a page from the DC Comics playbook and do a continuity reset. The Star Trek novels set after the various TV shows and movies were declared to have been part of a splinter universe, and novels that tied in with the new shows would recognize the events of those shows, not the previous series of novels, as canon. But, some of you might have detected another loophole. If the reason they reset the continuity of the novels was because it contradicted the continuity of the new TV shows, does that mean it's possible the reset doesn't affect the events of the Enterprise novels? After all, Enterprise and its tie-in novels are set in the 22nd century, and those relaunch novels that were eventually declared to have happened in a splinter timeline took place mostly in the late 24th century. There's a pretty big gap between the end of Enterprise and when the events of Discovery pick up in the middle of the 23rd century. Most of the stuff covered in those Enterprise novels, the Romulan War, the early years of the Federation, etc., is only referred to indirectly on screen. There's very little of any substance that's been established to even contradict. So why can't the Enterprise novels that are set after the end of the series be thought of as taking place in the prime timeline of the Star Trek universe instead of a splinter timeline? I mean, it's not like we're ever going to see any of the characters from Enterprise on screen again anyway. From Anthony Pascal on TrekMovie.com, August 8th, 2025. Exclusive. Scott Bakula eyeing Star Trek Return in President Archer series pitch from Enterprise producer. Quote, "The show would revolve around Archer's time as president, with writer-producer Mike Sussman likening it to shows like The West Wing, Homeland, and The Diplomat. It's a political thriller and a family drama set in those chaotic, formative years of the Federation." Sussman began outlining ideas for this potential series, working with Bakula, who liked the idea of a different take on the character. Sussman and Bakula even had a title ready, Star Trek United, though they also considered dropping the colon and going with Star Trek United. Well, it's important to be flexible. Colon or not, Star Trek United is still just an idea, a pitch. Nothing has been greenlit, there's no show as of yet, and there might not be. But if there is, it's safe to say the writers and producers of that show aren't going to be reading those post-Enterprise novels to make sure nothing in their show contradicts anything on those pages. If there's a new post-Enterprise TV series with Scott Bakula coming back as Archer and potentially other Enterprise alumni popping in for guest appearances, those novels are getting shoveled into the same splinter timeline as the TNG, DS9, and Voyager relaunches were. Bet on it. What would that mean as far as whether or not the events shown in These Are the Voyages actually happened? Who knows? We're deep into nerdy, circle jerk, speculative territory here. So, try not to touch anything. Maybe this hypothetical Star Trek United series would explicitly acknowledge that, yes, the events shown in These Are the Voyages happened. Riker's holodeck program is accurate, and Trip is dead. Or maybe they'll decide they want Trip to show up in the new series, and they'll have him still be alive in a way that doesn't necessitate ignoring the novels. He faked his death. He's a Section 31 agent, blah, blah, blah. Or maybe they'll decide they want Trip to show up and they'll invent a whole different reason why he's alive. Trip faked his own death to avoid having to give notes on Archer's big speech, which he found trite and poorly suited to the occasion, for instance. Or Trip faked his own death so he could avoid the surprise birthday party he knew his friends were planning for him the following week. Or Trip faked his own death because he knew that, with the entire Enterprise crew attending his memorial service, he'd be able to sneak into Malcolm's cabin and steal back the copy of Ghost of Frankenstein Malcolm borrowed from Trip and never returned, and every time Trip would ask him about it, Malcolm would promise to get it back to him the next day and then change the subject. Or maybe Trip faked his own death because he's a guy from Florida, and guys from Florida just do shit like that sometimes. Or maybe the Star Trek United series won't confirm or establish anything new about the Enterprise series finale. Maybe, because it will necessarily take place many years after the events of that series, it'll be a show about its own shit and won't concern itself with tidying up lingering uncertainties about a series that went off the air over 20 years earlier. Maybe Scott Bakula as Jonathan Archer will be the only legacy character on the show. I know, I've wandered off into Fantasyland, which is a separate place from nerdy circle jerk territory. Nerdy circle jerk territory is populated by nothing but legacy characters. Fantasyland is where they make new Star Trek shows centered on original characters who have original adventures that aren't just excuses to remind us of stuff from other Star Trek shows. In situations like this, the relevant tie-in novels exist in a kind of quantum superposition relative to the official canon. They aren't regarded as canon themselves, but unless and until something that is officially considered canon contradicts them, they might as well be. Sure, Trip faked his death and worked for Section 31, and the holo program Riker and Troy play about the final mission of Archer's Enterprise is inaccurate, is a retcon, but it fits in with the rest of what's been established on screen pretty well, and to date, there's been nothing produced since then that contradicts it. So, did Enterprise's final episode actually happen? No. Fuck it. Trip survived and became a spy. At least until a new show or movie comes along and tells you something different. Actually, forget that last part. The until a new show comes along and tells you different part, because as I see it, it shouldn't matter. I know this isn't the majority opinion among my fellow Trekkies, but I strongly believe that nobody should give that much of a shit about what's officially canon and what's not. Why does it matter? Did you watch an episode of Star Trek? Did you like it? Was it entertaining? Was it meaningful? Did it teach you something? Did it show you characters you thought were interesting? Did it tell you a story that emotionally involved you? If so, why should you care if it really happened? It's fiction. It didn't really happen, except on the screen and in here. The only canon that matters is the canon that is recognized by the thing you're watching right now. So, for example, if there is a Star Trek United series eventually, and if that series says that Trip didn't actually die, but rather faked his own death to get out of his Club Wyndham timeshare contract, then that's what happened, as far as that series is concerned. It didn't work, by the way. Death does not void a timeshare contract. If you're reading one of the Enterprise novels where Trip becomes a Section 31 agent and works undercover during the Earth-Romulan War, then as far as the book you're reading is concerned, that's what happened. And if you're watching the series finale of Enterprise, which shows us a holo program based on historical records in which Trip dies heroically to save his ship and gives no indication that said history has been altered or is otherwise unreliable, then, as far as that episode is concerned, that's what happened. Maybe you don't like that. Maybe you like Trip and don't want him to die like that, or maybe you find that development to be poorly written, or maybe there's some other reason. Whatever that reason might be, I would counsel you against indulging any instinct to treat the episode as though it didn't happen just because you didn't think it's good, or you don't like the direction it went. This is just how I see it, and I know the way I relate to Star Trek isn't the way a lot of you relate to it, but if you're someone who feels compelled to delete bad episodes or unwelcome plot developments from your personal headcanon, consider this. Bad episodes are allowed to exist. Writers and producers are allowed to make creative decisions you don't agree with. You don't have to like it, and God knows I'm the last person who will ever tell you that you ought to treat fictional TV shows like immutable historical archives. But if you only allow what you think of as the good stuff to count, you're not really relating to Star Trek on its own terms, because you're not going to like everything. Whether a given episode is good or bad is a subjective matter. What you think is what you think, and you're not going to think everything is good. I definitely don't. I love Star Trek, but I think a lot of it sucks. There are episodes, movies, seasons, hell, in a couple of cases, large swaths of whole series that I consider to be absolutely rotten. It's still Star Trek. It's still canon to the extent that I attach any meaning whatsoever to that concept. That's the neat thing. When you don't give a shit about what's canon, everything is canon. Even the stuff you think is shitty, even the stuff you think is shitty. Even the stuff that creates irreconcilable contradictions, especially the stuff that creates irreconcilable contradictions. Some fans act like a bad episode or a head-scratching creative decision is an intolerable stain on an otherwise pristine object, but Star Trek has never been such a thing. Star Trek is not this perfect creation. It's not all good. It's not all internally consistent. It's a collection of stories. That's what it is. That's what canon is, really, an accumulation of stories that relate to each other. Each story tells us how it relates to the others, tells us what its canon is, usually indirectly, sometimes explicitly. The details aren't important most of the time, but if they are, and it's a well-written story, it'll tell you what you need to know. Did Star Trek Enterprise's final episode even actually happen? Yes, it did. And no, it didn't. It depends. It shouldn't depend on whether you liked the episode or not, though I know for some of you it does. It should depend, I believe, very simply, on the terms set by the story you're watching or reading. That's not just the rule when it comes to the series finale of Enterprise, that's universal. And not that you asked, but that's my advice to you anytime you're about to watch or read or listen to a story. Accept the story on its own terms and see where it takes you. When it's over, you might think it was worth it, or you might not. But you won't find out by quibbling over whether or not it's canon. You've got to take the journey. Just like Trip had to take the journey to the Club Wyndham in Daytona Beach after faking his own death. If he can't get rid of the timeshare, he might as well enjoy it when he gets the chance. Am I right? Hey folks, hope you enjoyed this one. I'm going to let you know what the subject of the next Trek Actually video is going to be, but before I do that, I want to give shout-outs to some of my newest Patreon patrons and channel members. First, the new patrons. They are Shives, thanks Shives, Nick D, thanks Nick, Philip Gage, thanks Philip, Carver Tate, thanks Carver, Yogi, thanks Yogi, Kevin Spooner, thanks Kevin, Disturbia Anchorage, thanks Disturbia, Neil Klein, thanks Neil, Rich Matthews, thanks Rich, Algernon Asimov, thanks Algernon, and now the new channel member. They are Sirius Dinosaur. Thanks, Sirius Dinosaur. If you want to support this channel, you can do so by going to patreon.com/Steve Shives or clicking the join button to become a member of this channel. All patrons and members get access to exclusive posts that allow you to vote in the polls that determine upcoming Trek Actually topics, and also submit questions ahead of time for my twice-monthly Ask Away live streams. If you pledge $5 a month or more on Patreon or become a member at the $5 a month tier or higher, you get a shout out at the end of a Trek Actually video. If you'd rather give a one-time gift than a recurring monthly contribution, you're always more than welcome to do that by clicking the thanks button right below the video or via PayPal or Venmo. The links for those are in the video description. Many thanks. If you like what I do on YouTube, especially the Star Trek related stuff, you should also check out my side projects. The Ensign's Log, the Star Trek themed comedy podcast that I'm on alongside Jason Harding and Amanda Billings, and Trek Reluctantly, the watch-along stream Dana Cole and I do every Wednesday starting at 6 p.m. Eastern on this channel right here. As always, links in the description. Now, for next month's regulation Trek Actually topic, we step once again into the realm of the hypothetical. As I mentioned a few times during this video, Star Trek, like all works of fiction, is the product of creative choices on the part of the people who made the show. Once those choices have been made and the show is finished, it is what it is, and it's easy for us to imagine that it couldn't have been any other way. But if you go back through the history of the various Star Trek series, you can find certain points where some different choices, some surprisingly, one might even say confoundingly different choices, were almost made. I'll tell you about one such decision point and try to imagine how things might have been different in next month's video as I explore the question, what if the Starship Voyager actually made it home in Season 5? And yes, that was something they considered. I'm not making that up. We'll talk about it. That's next month. I'll be back then and a bunch of times before then. So until the next time you see me, whenever that is, thanks for watching and take care, everybody.